Joe, while House Republicans are backing legislation to roll back Dodd-Frank banking regulations, Democrats are calling the bill dead on arrival, as you just heard there from Maxine Waters. Joining us now here in New York, Chairman of the House Financial Services Committee and author of the Financial Choice Act, Republican Representative Jeb Hensarling of Texas, Walter Isaacson, Elise Jordan, Donnie Deutsch, all back with us as well. Congressman, great to have you here in New York. Thanks for joining us.
No, thanks for having me.
Is Maxine Waters right? Does this gut the Consumer Finance Bureau?
Well, what it does is it guarantees economic growth for all, bank bailouts for none. The best form of consumer protection is competitive, innovative, transparent markets that are vigorously policed for force and fraud. But the so-called CFPB, in many cases, have actually hurt consumers. I mean, since it has come into fruition, we've seen free checking at banks cut in half. Bank fees are up. The ranks of the unbanked have increased. Credit cards, we have 15% fewer offerings. They cost 200 basis points more. Mortgages cost $100 more to close. They're harder to come by. So in many cases, this particular agency, which perhaps is the most unaccountable and powerful agency in the history of the Republic, in many cases has hurt consumers. What we're trying to do is actually replace it. Replace it with something called the Consumer Law Enforcement Agency that is there to actually enforce our roughly 24 major federal consumer protection laws. But it's there to enforce the law, not make up the law. And this particular agency is making up the law.
You obviously disagree with the particulars of Dodd-Frank, but did you believe in the wake of the financial crash of 2008 that something had to happen, that there had to be more supervision of big banks? Generally, do you think they had to be looked at more closely?
Well, deregulation is a myth. I mean, for 10 years leading up to the financial crisis, we actually had a 17% increase in regulation. So it wasn't so much a matter of deregulation, it was a matter of dumb regulation, and that was laws and regulation that incented banks to loan money to people to buy homes they could not afford to keep. And so I think you could make the case in many respects that we needed more capital in our system. I don't think you could make the case that we needed more complexity in our system. And Dodd-Frank has broken all of its promises. It said it would lift the economy, and yet we continue to be stuck in a 1.5% to 2% GDP growth economy. It said it would end bank bailouts, but cynically it codified them into law. It said it would make our financial system more stable, but the big banks are actually bigger. And the small banks are fewer. We're losing one a day. And then last but not least, again, it said it would help the consumers, but in many cases, consumers are worse off. We've had 7 years of Dodd-Frank. It's failed, and we need economic growth for all, bank bailouts for none. The answer is more capital, not more regulation.
Congressman, this bill seems likely to pass, and you have taken out the Durbin Amendment portion of the bill. Can you talk about why you chose to compromise and what, in the future, the future holds for the Durbin Amendment?
Well, occasionally I help my 8th grade son with his math, so I can perform simple math. The votes weren't there. I'm sorry. I personally think that the Durbin Amendment represents federal price controls. I think it's the #1 reason that many consumers have lost free checking. But, it's part of the democratic process. We went out and found out the votes weren't there for that. It was actually impeding the progress of the entire bill. So there's so much else that's good in the bill, and replacing complexity with simplicity, replacing bailouts for banks with bankruptcy, and replacing private capital with taxpayer capital, but that particular provision had to get jettisoned overboard.
Let me ask,
sorry, go ahead, Donnie.
What is the logic for now banks only have to go every 2 years for a stress test? I would want my banks to be stress tested more, not less. Give me the logic behind that.
Well, #1, the crux of our bill is to have a 10% simple leverage ratio, which is more capital, far more capital than is required by Dodd-Frank, far more capital than is required by the Basel Accords as well. So we are looking, again, to replace, again, complexity with capital, and 98% of the banks that had a 10% simple leverage ratio survived the second worst financial panic. So with respect to stress tests, again, the bank administered stress test will continue on an annual basis. What they call the CCAR process will be on a biannual basis. And so we think that, again, with stronger levels of capital, that this is the appropriate regime we ought to have.
I'm going to ask you a much broader question, and it comes down to your bill. up until about 10, 15 years ago, if you were going to do a big banking regulation bill, or for that matter, a big health care bill or whatever, it would be done through the regular order of business, and you'd try to get people from both parties to figure out how to do it. We've lost that in our society. This type of legislation on banks shouldn't necessarily be a pure ideological, pure partisan issue. I'm not saying it's your fault. I'm not saying it was the Obama administration's fault. I'm just saying all these things have fallen apart. Is that a bad thing, and can we fix that?
Well, in the last Congress, in my committee, we managed to get roughly 35 bills signed by President Obama. Not my favorite president as a conservative Republican, but we still managed to work on a bipartisan basis, and so I take with some pride we managed to do that. I stand ready to negotiate with anybody at any time, and just not going to negotiate against myself. The Senate is a very different animal than the House.
But you're not going to get any Democratic votes for this bill?
Well, let's stay tuned till Thursday, but I'm not encouraged.
Are you trying
I'm not
hard
encouraged at the at
Are you
the
trying
moment.
hard to get Democratic votes?
I'm going to try hard to get Democrat votes to ultimately get this signed into law. Now, certain portions of the Financial Choice Act can be passed through this process called reconciliation, which means it needs a simple majority, not a supermajority in the Senate. I think there are provisions of the Financial Choice Act that could draw Democratic support. But, you know, elections do have consequences. Right now, we have a Republican House, a Republican Senate, a Republican in the White House, so there shouldn't be a surprise that substantially we have Republican policies. But again, we've had 7 years of Dodd-Frank. It's failed on each and every one of its promises. And I got to tell you, for the factory worker in Mesquite, Texas that I represent, for the farmer in Mineola, Texas, 1.5% to 2% economic growth is not doing anything for their American dream.
All right, Congressman Jeb Hensarling, we'll be watching that.